Good morning, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on plastic and health, the hidden costs of a plastic planet, with David Azoulay of the Center for International Environmental Law and Sirine Rached of Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives. Both organizations are working in partnership with numerous others worldwide to expose how plastic threatens human health on a global scale and to take actions to curb the crisis. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CIEL Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CIEL Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. We have well over 100 podcasts from past CIEL Alaska teleconferences on our website at akaction.org. You can also find more information at healthandenvironment.org, the national CIEL website. Our presenters will be co-presenting today from one set of presentation slides. The slides have been converted to PDF. For those of you new to our CIEL Alaska calls, this is an audio-only teleconference, not a webinar, so you will need to first download the document and then click through it to follow along. I sent the link a few hours ago to everyone who had registered by that time. If you signed up after that email went out, please go to the Alaska Community Action on Toxics website at akaction.org to download the document. Our call will last 1 hour with time towards the end for discussion and your questions. The adverse health effects of chemicals and plastics has long been a concern and priority for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And we're so happy that after much coordinating across time zones and schedules, as David is in Switzerland and Sirine is in France, they were both able to join us today to talk about the health impacts of exposure to plastics throughout the life cycle of plastic and to discuss the major step taken by 187 countries last month, not the United States, as you'll hear more about, when these countries agreed to add plastic to the Basel Convention, a treaty that controls the movement of hazardous waste from one country to another. And I should mention that Alaska Community Action on Toxics Director and co-chair of IPEN, Pam Miller, was also at the Basel Convention, and I've included a link to an interview with her that was on Democracy Now! In May, and that's in the resources list that I sent out earlier today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. David Azoulay is the Managing Attorney of the Center for International Environmental Law's Geneva office and the Director of its Environmental Health Program. He leads the Center's Nanotechnology Project and chairs the IPEN Nanotechnologies Working Group. David also co-leads the Center for International Environmental Law's work on plastics, examining the environmental health impacts of plastic throughout its life cycle and engaging others in global policy forums to address the plastic crisis. Sirine Rached is Global Policy Advocate at the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, or GAIA, a worldwide alliance of more than 800 grassroots groups, non-governmental organizations, and individuals in over 90 countries. Sirine seizes opportunities within global policy institutions, including the UN Environmental Assembly and the Basel Convention, to address the plastic pollution crisis and fight plastic waste incineration, putting the priorities of GAIA and its membership, as well as the Break Free from Plastic movement, on the global policy agenda. Welcome to you both. You may go ahead and begin.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good morning, everyone. So I'm David Azoulay, and thank you very much for the introduction. I will indicate when it's time to switch slides. So we're still in the opening slide right now. Just a quick word to say that the report that we're going to talk about in the first part of this webinar was indeed curated and compiled by CIEL, but it is actually a collaborative effort. You can go to slide 2 of a large number of organizations, including Healthy Babies, Bright Future, GAIA, Upstreams, IPEN, Break Free from Plastic, TEJAS, the Texas Environment Justice Advocacy Service, and Earthwork. And really the idea was to compile the state-of-the-art or latest knowledge about the health impacts of plastics throughout its life cycle, to tell the full story of plastic, because we felt that a lot of the story wasn't told when plastic was being discussed, in particular health impacts. You can go to slide number 3. So I'll start with a quick introduction about what plastic is, or what plastics are, to be more precise. We are talking about a very large number of different types of polymers, as well as additives and other substances that are often referred to as not intentionally added substances. The additives that are added to the polymers fulfill a very large variety of function to make your plastic, to give color to your plastic, to make your plastic flexible or hard or waterproof or airproof for food packaging or others. And for this, plastic uses a lot of different types of chemicals in the thousands or hundreds of thousands of different types of chemicals that are sometimes added to the plastic. In the slide, you have a list of examples: phthalates, bromidated, flame retarded, lead compounds, various kinds of pups, stabilizer for colors, etc. In most of the plastic additives, chemical additives comprise about 20% of the plastic, but in some cases, including PVC, it can go up to 80%. So by mass, so there's a large amount of chemicals in addition to the polymers when we're talking about plastics. Humans are exposed through a variety of pathways because plastic is now pervasive in every compartment in our environment. It's in our ocean, it's in the fresh water that we drink, it's in the agricultural soil, it's in the water, it's in the air that we breathe. In fact, one could argue that babies are now born pre-polluted because a lot of toxic chemicals that are associated with plastic, including phthalates and others, can now be found in newborns' bloodstream. Another element to understand when we're talking about exposure to plastic, we need to talk about the exposure to the polymers themselves to assess their health impact, as well as health impacts of the additives. And this is why I'm always constantly making a difference between those two. Once plastic gets into the environment, and we'll talk a little later about this, it fragments into smaller and smaller particles, microparticles, and down to nanoparticles, which makes the plastic bioavailable again. And as it degrades, new surface area of the plastic is being exposed, so environmental plastic will leach toxic additives in the environment. But microplastic will also act as a sort of sponge or magnet for toxics that are present in the environment, pups or other elements. And one thing that will be pervasive throughout my discussing of the report is showing how the opaqueness or lack of transparency throughout the supply chain makes risk assessment relating to plastic extremely limited, and every information that is made available in that respect actually shows that our prior assessment were underestimating the probable risks of plastic. So that question of lack of transparency, you'll see, will infuse all of the work that we're presenting now. I will only go very quickly and very briefly through the report. Rather than presenting all of the conclusions of the report, I will present briefly what you will be able to find in the actual report. And so you'll have a chance to go into a little more detail. So that leaves us more time for questions and answers. So you can go to the next slide, slide 4. And really, at the beginning, at the origin of this report, was the recognition that when we talk about plastic, too often we're talking about the very end of the life cycle, very last stages of plastic. Sometimes we're talking about plastic objects, the one that we use as consumer. Most of the time we're talking about plastic waste and plastic once it's in the environment. And when you do this, when you only focus on that part of the story, you're missing, because there's still a lot of data gaps and knowledge gaps, you're missing a lot of important points, and allows you to sometimes argue or articulate that there isn't really any proven negative health impact of plastic in the environment. So we decided there's a large part of the story that is missing in there, because plastic is actually fossil fuel, and we need to look at the whole process to better understand what are the exact impacts of plastics. So we've divided the life cycle of plastic into different stages: extraction, refining and manufacturing, consumer use, waste management, and plastic once it's escaped in the environment. You can go to next slide, the slide number 5 now. On this slide, you see, and this is one of the infographics that you'll find in the report, we try to identify for each of the stages the different types of exposure for humans. So inhalation exposure, or in exposure through ingestion, through skin contact, the different kinds of substances to which people are exposed, as well as their different health effects. So I invite you to look a little more closely into the infographics. I am not going to read through the whole thing. One thing that you can hear, or one thing that you can already note, is that at every stage of the life cycle, humans are being exposed to a very vast quantity of toxic materials, whether they're carcinogenic, endocrine disruptors, heavy metals, dioxins, or others. So that's true for the 4 main life cycle stages: the extraction, transport, refining and manufacture, consumer use, and waste management. And each of those activities, or each of those stages, also release both microplastic and toxic chemicals into the different compartments of the environment: the farmland, the agricultural soil, air, and all the freshwater and ocean ecosystem. And again, there is a lot of different exposures once the plastic is in the environment, with very serious health impacts. So you can move to the next slide now. And that slide gives you a quick snapshot of the various substances that are being used, that have been identified as being present in the operation for fracking. Because one thing you need to know is, because of the fracking boom that is happening in the US, companies are extracting a lot more gas than they used to, and it's becoming more difficult for them to turn that gas into actual fuel because of climate consideration and other regulatory. So obviously the next relay for profit for all of these companies is to make petrochemicals and plastic out of it. So when we're talking about plastic, really the journey of your plastic, whether it's the rubber duck or the wrapping on your food or the toys that your kids play with, it starts at the pad, at the fracking pads, fracking wells. And there's a long list of chemicals right there, and this is not taken from how could I say, green freaks or activists. This list is actually recognized by the US EPA, which are not known for being great environmental activists. And the EPA itself has identified over 170 substances, carcinogenic and highly toxic substances, into fracking operation. There is no slide in this presentation that is talking about the manufacture and refining of the gas, but one thing you need to know is that workers and communities around the facilities that transform this gas into plastic are also being exposed to a large number of toxic chemicals, including some chemicals that have been identified as very serious bone marrow poison for over a century, like benzene. And of course, this is also a trend that you will see, or that you will hear about throughout the presentation and throughout the life cycle of plastic. Most of those polluting activities, the refineries, the facilities that transform plastic, that manufacture the polymers and the chemicals, are located in poor communities, or colored communities, and most often in disenfranchised communities. And these are communities that have no access to information about what those facilities release in the atmosphere, in the water around where they live, on the soil on which they grow their food, etc. And this is a massive challenge. So you can go to the next slide now, slide number 7. And slide number 7 shows you 2 different tables that are present in the report, and that identified the common toxic chemical additives to plastic. That's the table on the right. You'll see acrylonitrile, bisphenol, cadmium, flame retardant, lead, PFAS, phthalates, and others. And what this table does is compile this list of the most common and most toxic additives, what products they can be found in, and what are their health impacts. The other table is an example of a work that was done by an academic that tried to rank the various polymers, the various types of plastic, based on hazard classification of the constituent monomers. So all these are information that you will find in the report. The report is heavily referenced, so it's also a very good source to look a little further. Now, and of course, all of these chemicals and all of these toxics are being released through the use, whether it's in house dust for flame retardant, for example, or through leaching from the packaging into your food or into the water or into the air we breathe. So there is very serious concern about exposure to these various toxic chemicals during the use phase. The exact physical and health impacts of polymers, of the virgin polymer itself, without considering the additive, is still relatively new. The science is still relatively new. There's a lot of pieces of information missing, but what we're seeing in a number of other mammals and others are noticing some physical impacts on the digestive tract system, etc. Now, once you've extracted the gas, transported it through pipelines and other, turn that into various types of polymers and toxic additives, and once you've used your plastic toy or food packaging, you have to get rid of it. And this is where we get into the question of what are the impacts of the way plastic waste is being managed. And for that, I'm going to give the floor to my co-presenter, Sirine.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to focus on waste incineration, given its very specific and concerning health impacts. So waste incineration, which is also called by industry as waste to energy in an attempt to remarket this outdated technology, is a form of waste management that directly contradicts any attempt to prevent or reduce waste, given it relies on a steady and usually quite important flow of waste. Waste incineration can also happen in cement kilns or industrial boilers, and it's referred to as co-incineration and has similar impacts. So I'm going to start by saying that waste incineration usually seductively claims to make waste disappear or even transform it into energy, but this isn't true. It basically transforms waste, including plastic waste, into usually even more toxic substances and pollution. This pollution happens through emissions at the stack and through different kinds of ash, also through wastewater and sludge. About 25 to 30% of the volume of the original waste is transformed into ashes and sludge, which require careful management. Emissions from the stack can travel a long way, and ashes and sludge are either dumped in the open environment or stored in landfill or other sites where there may be a risk of leaching. And sometimes they're even used in construction materials or as agricultural fertilizer, despite the risks that I'm going to go over in a second. So the following classes of pollutants are found in incineration emissions, ash, and sludge. We have heavy metals that are neurotoxic, including mercury, lead, cadmium, arsenic, and chromium, mainly. There's also organic pollutants, including dioxins and furans, PCBs, and other persistent organic pollutants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So the effects of these kind of chemicals include carcinogenic effects and endocrine disrupting effects, as well as effects or impacts on IQ levels or intelligence. And I'm sure that many of you are more than familiar by the impact of dioxin pollution, given how Arctic communities have been affected. Another class of pollutants that's released by waste incineration is acid gases, such as sulfur oxides, hydrogen chlorides, and nitrogen oxides that contribute to smog and acid rain, as well as greenhouse gases, including CO2, but also carbon monoxide, which indirectly increases the potency of other greenhouse gases like methane, for instance. And another class of pollution, which in a way relates to what David was saying earlier, is particulate matter, including nanoparticles, which are, their danger increases with the smaller they are, the more dangerous they are, and the further they travel. And the smaller they are, the harder they are to filter. So the smallest known particulate matter are not currently captured by any filtering devices used in waste incinerators, including the newest models that are on the market and that are currently operating. And particulate matter has been linked to health outcomes, including respiratory problems, inflammation, and cancer. It's worth noting that many of these pollutants persist in the environment and bioaccumulate in living organisms and magnify as we go up the food chain. This means that obviously the animals at the top of the food chain will have larger concentrations, which is a problem when they are also food sources for humans, a specific problem for us, also known in Arctic communities, unfortunately. And these pollutants also probably have additional effects when they interact with each other, but most of these cumulative effects are yet to be studied thoroughly. So there's an unknown risk that is there and that we are taking by using these technologies. And finally, it's worth noting that pollution and climate change impacts per unit of energy produced are far higher in incinerators, including waste-to-energy incinerators, far higher than in coal power plants. This is the case when we look at greenhouse gases. It's also the case, for example, when we look at mercury emissions. So considering all of these classes of pollutants, there's a few considerations I'd like to share with you. First of all, air pollution control systems used in incinerators are inadequate. As I mentioned, even the newest ones don't capture the finest and most dangerous particulate matter that comes out of the stack, or can be in the fly ash, which might be which might first not come out of the stack of the incinerator, but be stored somewhere else, and it remains very volatile, can easily spread if it's not well stored. These ashes are a form of hazardous waste that is challenging, costly, and risky to manage. Second consideration is that monitoring is inadequate. So incinerators are designed to function at high temperatures, and a lot of pollutants are actually created and emitted when the temperatures are not that high. So when the incinerator starts or shuts down, when there's a malfunction, and these kind of episodes usually happen on a routine basis. The problem is that conventional monitoring protocols don't happen in these phases. They happen during optimal operational conditions, and they're punctual, and they only monitor a limited range of chemicals. So we don't really know what's coming out of these incinerators, and the longer monitoring protocols exist, but they're seldom used. But there is no continuous and comprehensive monitoring going on in any incinerators. So we're really gambling with these technologies, despite the seriousness of the risks associated with the chemicals I mentioned earlier. The third idea I want to share with you is that there are other forms of incineration. So they're sometimes described as plastic to fuel, and they include pyrolysis and gasification, as well as plasma arc, are just as problematic from the health side, and they don't perform well. So these are basically forms of waste incineration with limited air or oxygen during the operation, or that use much higher temperatures. They also produce either toxic emissions, ash, or slag, and their climate change impacts are also negative once we consider the combustion of the byproducts, because the byproduct of these processes is usually syngas, which is destined to be ultimately burned. And so the original fossil fuels from the plastics end up in the atmosphere. And finally, as I was saying, they don't perform well. These technologies there were many attempts to roll these technologies out at scale, and they have failed. And I'd be happy to share some case studies with any of you if you email me afterwards. My last thought before I close on the health impacts of waste incineration is that they deepen inequalities. So incinerations are disproportionately built in low-income and marginalized communities, burdening them with toxic pollution as well as accidents. And so the health impacts there come and deepen the inequalities that already exist in our societies. Thank you, David. On to you.
Thanks, Sirine. And so, as you all probably noticed, we were on slide 8. We're now going to move to slide 9. Just one quick note before we do, to mention that in the report you'll find also some assessment and information about the potential health impact of a number of other ways that were proposed to deal with plastic waste, whether it's making roads out of it or making houses out of discarded plastic, etc. So the report actually goes even a little deeper than this. So now we're moving to slide 9, and before we conclude on the conclusions or the finding of the report, there is one additional element that is really key to consider when thinking about our current plastic crisis and what kind of solutions can be designed for it, is that we're currently on track to increase production of virgin plastic by a third within the next 5 years. And I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of the very high-profile Industry Alliance Against Plastic Waste, where they've invested a whopping $1.5 billion to help countries better manage their waste. You need to understand that in parallel, those same companies are investing $202 billion. So that's over 200 times what they're invested to deal with the waste. So $202 billion to increase to build infrastructure to increase plastic production. And that is a major issue. And if you go to slide 10, it's a major issue because this new capacity would lock in massive expansion of cheap plastic production for decades. And if this is not addressed, it could basically largely undermine all other efforts that we're seeing all around to reduce plastic use and plastic pollution, including the various single-use bans, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what did the report is not just about painting a very bleak picture, and bleak it is, we understand that, but it's also about, so what is the next step? How does this report help us think about possible solution and how to move forward? So one thing to understand, and I mentioned that at the beginning of our talk, the life cycle of plastic is quite complex and involves a large variety of actors. And so the plastic crisis will require a variety of solutions and options. But we've identified a number of guiding principles that should frame how we discuss about potential solution to the plastic crisis. And the first one is put human health and human rights at the core, at the center of any future approaches to deal with the plastic crisis. Another element that is really, really important is to make the invisible visible. One of the reasons why plastic has gained so much attention lately, in whether it's on your social media feed or even on your general media, is because we've all seen plastic pollution. We've all seen bags and litters all around. But what we don't see is actually the most problematic. All the microplastic, and the vast majority of the plastic now in the environment is in the form of micro or nanoplastic. All the chemicals that are released around plastic. This is really critical to make that visible. And it's also important because it allows actors along the supply chain, whether it's regulators, consumers, recyclers, or others, to know what they're dealing with and act appropriately when faced with this. And that has been a major subject of fight with the plastic industry, for them to just release what is in the plastic that they're putting on the market. Very key to also designing solution, avoiding false solution. Any of you who has gone to any conference about the plastic crisis will have heard the industry lobbyists talk about we need to increase recycle. Incineration is a good way to deal with plastic. Plastic to road or plastic to houses. All those are false solutions in that they only either postpone the moment when the plastic is going to enter into the environment, or actually even concentrate some of the toxins. And the last point that we identified, because of the globality of the supply chain, and because plastic is so pervasive everywhere, it is important to think globally, think about in a global context, and act everywhere. Every single action is relevant. And in that respect, I mentioned that at the very end because it's a good segue into the rest of our presentation, when we're going to talk to you about the ongoing initiatives at the global level to change the international global regulation to address plastic. So you can move to slide number 12 now, where there's a quick presentation of a number of instruments that exist that are relevant to addressing the plastic crisis. There is the Stockholm Convention, which I'm guessing most of you are familiar with, that deal with the POPs, the persistent organic pollutant, but it also deals about the amount of POPs that can be found in a product before it is considered hazardous and cannot be recycled. And it is a key element because when you recycle plastic that contains POPs, those POPs are then being concentrated into the recycled materials. And if you create, for example, a toy in recycled plastic, that can be a very, very serious issue. There is also a problem that under the Stockholm Convention, a number of POPs benefit from exemption for recycling. There is the Basel Convention that talks about hazardous transboundary movement of hazardous waste. We're going to go into more details about this. And I also wanted to mention just the UNEA process. So UNEA stands for United Nations Environment Assembly. And the UNEA has been discussing for 4 years now how to address the plastic crisis at the global level. And as discussion progressed, there is more and more traction for the development of a new treaty, global treaty about plastic. And this treaty would, or at least the objective and what more and more countries are now aligning with, it would be a treaty that limits the production of virgin plastic, as well as create restriction on the kind of additives that can be used, as well as encourage or mandate governments to adopt national action plans to implement that. At the bottom of slide number 12, you see that there is a link. This link will send you to a page with a number of newsletters, and the Break Free from Plastic movement, CIEL and all of its partners and everyone who's been participating in all of those international meetings at UNEA, at the Basel Convention and others, we basically document everything that happens in those meetings in a number of newsletters. So you'll find, I think we're down to 10 or 12 newsletters, and each newsletter is dedicated to a particular meeting. So you'll find a lot more information, both about what was negotiated there, what was adopted or not adopted, but also about the negotiation dynamic, the position of different actors, different countries, and others. So now let's focus on the global plastic waste trade and how the decision that was adopted, was it last month or 2 months ago in Geneva at the Conference of Parties of the Convention, will actually change the whole structure of the plastic waste trade. So moving down now to slide 14, I'm going to give you a very brief, very high-level overview of how the Basel Convention functions. And the Basel functions in a very simple way, as it establishes different lists of waste, that will be subject to different kinds of requirements when they're being moved across international border. And you basically have a green, yellow, and red lists. Anything that's on the green list can be freely traded all around the planet, with some of the consequences that Sirine is going to talk to you about after that. The yellow and red list of waste require, at the very minimum, that when these wastes that are listed in the yellow and red list are being exported to another country, the importing countries needs to be informed about the nature and quantity of the waste that the exporter wants to send, and they have to give their consent to the import, making sure that they actually have the capacity to deal with these lists. So I'm now going to give the floor again to Sirine to tell you a little more about what is the current situation before we provide some details about what was adopted in Basel and how this will change.
Thank you, David. So very briefly, before 2018, China received most of the world's plastic waste. But given the environmental and health impacts and the growth of its middle class, it eventually decided to close the door to these foreign plastic waste flows. And then what we saw was impact in neighboring countries. And on this slide 14, you can see the cover for a report Gaia did documenting these trends on the ground, focusing on Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So if you click on the Waste Trade Stories link or use that, it'll take you both to a website that contains both this report and a data briefing by Greenpeace, looking at the trends since 2018. So I'm going to give you a very high-level picture of what we found in terms of those plastic waste flows. Basically, much of the plastic waste flows, even though they were being traded officially for recycling abroad, they're in fact unrecyclable. So a lot of plastic waste bales were mixed or dirty, which made recycling difficult. A high proportion of these bales was materials that are inherently unrecyclable, what we call residuals. So they're either composite or multi-layer materials with different plastics or different materials that are fused together, or materials that are made from plastic polymers that are not safe to recycle, even when they're clean or unmixed, especially in countries that lack infrastructure, things like PVC. A lot of the waste that we observed and that our members have been documenting and monitoring and auditing is packaging waste that through the labels, can be clearly traced to the countries where it was consumed, at least. And I'll just comment that e-waste is a massive problem that doesn't lend itself to safe recycling either. And if you're interested in this, I really recommend that you look at the work of the Basel Action Network. So what we've seen is really north-south dumping of unrecyclable plastic waste under the guise of recycling. And this brings up inequality dynamics very similar to the ones we mentioned earlier in relation to incineration, which has led some people to call this waste colonialism. Much of this plastic waste ends up in dumps, where some of it catches fire, creating health and pollution impacts similar to the ones we discussed for incineration. They leak into the open environment. Some materials are captured by informal waste pickers who either attempt to recycle them in unmonitored backyard operations that have pollution implications, especially for water, soil, and air, but also they resell them as fuel sometimes. So you'll find tofu factories in Indonesia that instead of using, let's say, firewood or coal to boil the cauldrons that make tofu, they burn plastic. And I can let you imagine what the health implications might be. So some of these wastes are also traded and destined for cement kilns for co-incineration. The problem with cement kilns is, compared even to traditional incinerators, they tend not to have any or very little attempts to even filter what comes out of those stacks, and the ashes are typically reintegrated into the cement. They're not even separated, or they're not managed correctly. We've seen signs of environmental and health impacts, including respiratory and skin problems, heart disease, crop and livestock death. Obviously, health impacts are expensive and take a long time to document, and we're talking here about resource-scarce governments that struggle to even give adequate healthcare to their populations. So given the inequality dynamics, these communities are really struggling to either protect their health from these impacts or get healthcare once they're ill. Important thing to highlight is that this kind of operations would never fly in the US or in Europe because of our environmental laws and the way these are enforced. So really, it's global trade taking advantage of weakness in regulation or implementation of environmental regulation to manage this plastic waste that has no real value at this point. So governments in the region, especially China, Malaysia, now India, Thailand, have announced bans on plastic waste imports nationally, and some of them have been sending shipments back with a lot of fanfare, as you've seen in the Philippines and in Malaysia. Sorry. And the last comment is that responsible recyclers that have been trying to address the implications of any recyclables that they've been exporting abroad, like the Ecology Center in Berkeley, have known these realities for a long time. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Sirine. And the reason the situation that Sirine just described was made possible was because until now, all of the plastic waste was part of the green list under Basel Convention. Enters Norway and their proposal for amendment that was adopted, and that completely changes the situation. So you can move to slide number 15 now, and that's the situation about after the amendment. And now the situation is that all plastic waste, except those that are listed, and I'm going to present very briefly, are now moving to the yellow list, which means mainly one thing, that the countries who will want to export them will have to notify and get the prior informed consent of the importing countries, which will really give the possibility to receiving countries to stop the massive movement of dumping. It has another additional consequences for countries that are not parties to the Basel Convention, like the US, but I will mention that very briefly. So which are the wastes that now remain on the green list of Basel? I.e., what are the wastes that can still be traded freely internationally? So there are four groups of those wastes, of those exemptions that are now on the green list. One is batches of single polymer, non-halogenated polymer. So that means we're talking about waste that is being sorted by polymer. So most of the fabric, for example, will not qualify because they're a mix of different polymers. So shipments of waste that are sorted by polymer, that are clean, that are uncontaminated, and that they're destined for recycling in an environmentally sound manner and almost free from contamination. The second point is a mixture of certain types of non-halogenated polymer. And here, a lot of the example in the negotiation were about, well, what about plastic bottles? We can recycle both the cap and the core of the bottle. They're made of two different polymers, but they're very easy to separate. They can be shredded together, and then they have different densities. So we should still be able to export them. So an exemption was built into the amendment where mixtures comprising of PE polyethylene, PP polypropylene, or PET, provided that they're destined for separate recycling by polymer in an environmentally sound manner and almost free from contamination and other types of waste. So those are the two big categories that can still be traded freely, which most likely will not be traded internationally, because these are the part of plastic waste that have a value. So typically, these are the waste that the U.S. Sorts at home and doesn't export. The U.S. exports everything else because it doesn't have real value. There are two other exceptions that are a little more problematic. One is a exhaustive list of some fluorinated waste, fluorinated resin. It's a big problem because fluorine, when incinerated or when open burn, can be a source of dioxin or other types of POPs or PFOS and others. Plus, fluorinated waste are actually halogenated. They shouldn't be in there, but there was a quirk in the negotiation that let them stay in there, as well as plastic waste that are comprised almost exclusively of one type of pure resin of condensation product. Those two still need to be destined for recycling in an environmentally sound manner and free from contamination and other types of waste, but they're a little more problematic. Thankfully, we managed to include in the amendment a requirement that these two exemptions, the cured resin and the fluorinated waste, will be revised and will be reassessed at the next COP to see if they can be eliminated from that particular exemption and join all the rest of the plastic waste on the yellow list. Now, one thing that I mentioned earlier, all this description about the need for prior informed consent to trade these different kind of waste applies between different parties. For countries that are not parties, like the US, which is the first producer and exporter of plastic waste in the world, those wastes that are on the orange and red list cannot be traded between parties and non-parties. So it means that everything that I just mentioned, all of the plastic waste except those that have value, cannot be traded, cannot be exported by the US. So on the slide, next slide 16, you'll see some pictures about all the incredible people that participated in this success. You'll probably recognize some people from the Alaskan network and others, as well as three links to three briefings or studies that will allow you to get into a little more detail about what this amendment means. Now, there's still a number of challenges ahead. First of all, the fact that this amendment will enter into force on January 1st, 2021. There will be a question about enforcement. There will be the question of the revision of the amendment that I mentioned before. There is the question of plastic waste co-incineration that may be increasing because of this, but really we want to leave at least 15 minutes for the question and answers. So Sirine, I think we'll just conclude there. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're now very much looking forward to answering your questions. And one final thing before we go into the Q&A, if any of you doesn't have time to ask their question, our contact detail, both Sirine and I, are on the last slide. Please feel free to reach out to us if you want to further discuss any aspect of the presentation or go any further.
Thank you, David. Thank you both so much for your excellent presentation identifying key aspects of the global plastics crisis. I know that you had a lot to cover in a short time, and you provided so many ways for folks to learn more, but now is our opportunity for participants to ask further questions of our guest speakers or otherwise contribute to the discussion. So if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation. And when you're finished, if you could mute your line again by pressing *2, that will be helpful to prevent background noise. So again, *2 to unmute your line, and we are looking forward to having about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion.
Are we supposed to speak at this point?
Actually, is that Sabine or is that someone else?
This is Sarah Casper.
Yes, you are invited to ask a question or make a comment now at this time, yes.
Okay. Thank you all for doing this. One of the biggest problems I have with people that I know is a total uninformed group of people that thinks that once it goes into their recycling bin, that's it. And so the more information that people like me can get, the better. So I'm having a problem. For some reason, none of this came up on my computer. So I have to guess at what your slides are. But I think one of the important things is for me to ask is, and you pretty much stated this, but more clarification. Much of our plastics don't go any further than the US because nobody wants them, or they're so bad that nobody wants them. Is there an organization in the States? Is that something that EPA would do that would say, okay, this is what you may do with these plastics and what you may not? Or is it pretty much what you have been saying? There isn't anybody who is monitoring what goes on with plastics, how they are disposed of.
Thank you, Sarah. Do either of you want to have a response about what can be done here in the United States to inform people?
Right.
What can we do?
Maybe sorry, go ahead.
What can we do to inform, and how can we safely dispose of them? Some of the things you mentioned, but there's still a big area that is very, very gray.
Absolutely. So fully agree, and I think that what makes things untransparent was this ability to dump this recycling, this waste destined for so-called recycling abroad, and having it in country will compel authorities to take responsibility for it. Now, in the U.S., like in many other places, a lot of the waste management work happens at the city level. So that's helpful for us because it's easier for civil society to access authorities at the city level than at the federal level. So what is possible to do? Our movement, Break Free from Plastic, is present in the U.S. Any organization that follows our principles is welcome to join. It's also open to joining from individuals, and the push for transparency, I think, is crucial. One idea that's been raised is to make those recycling rates much more transparent and detailed. So when we talk about a recycling rate, in a city or in a state or at the national level, to have a breakdown of what actually happens with those materials, where they go, and what impacts they have.
And I'm sorry, I got disconnected during a small moment, so I just want to add something. Stop me if it has been said already. But I think there are two things to consider. One, the beginning of your question, you said a lot of people are uninformed, and in this case, global statistics are useful just to show people the general order of magnitude of what we're talking about. And of all the plastic that was ever created, 9% has been recycled, 12% has been incinerated, and all the rest has gone into the environment via landfills or others. So these are the kind of figures that we're talking about. And another element to consider about the why this is happening is in large part because recycled plastic is not economically viable. And the reason for that is because fossil fuel, so the commodity out of which we make plastic, is very heavily subsidized. And I know I said I made only 2 points, but I actually want to make a third point, which is very important for people to understand, which is there is no such thing as plastic recycling. There is downcycling, there is open loop recycling, but every time you recycle a PET bottle, and PET is really the apex plastic, the one plastic that we can best recycle, every time you recycle PET, you lose between 30 and 40% in mass in the process. And this is 30 or 40% of mass of plastic that ends up in the environment. And also because of the plastic through the recycling process loses some of its quality, the types of quality of plastic that you get at the end of the first recycling loop is much poorer than virgin plastic. So you have to add virgin plastic to make the same object again. And so basically when we're talking about recycling, what we're really saying is that we're postponing the moment in which this plastic will go into the environment by 1 or 2 or maximum 3 cycles, but it's not actual recycling. Again, it's just postponing the moment with which the plastic will get into the environment.
Okay,
Thank you.
Quick question, just really quick. And
is this still Sarah, or is this another person asking?
Yeah, I know. I don't want to take up everybody else's
Yeah, if you
time.
could make it brief, because I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to get to a few more.
And if I can get access to the webinar, then you can put the answers on that. How do you define virgin plastic?
Virgin plastic is plastic that is made out of that is not made out of recycled plastic. Virgin plastic is plastic that is made out of fossil fuel for 99%, or 1% that is made out of plant-based material. But virgin plastic is the transformation of a fossil material into plastics.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, to unmute your line, press *2.
This is Dr. Joyce Young, a naturopathic physician on Cape Cod here in Massachusetts, and I have a very strong interest in the use of biocides in plastics, especially MIT methyl-isothiazolinene. It turns out from my research, I'm a research scientist, also that a very large proportion of plastics are preserved with biocides because bacteria and fungi will eat up plasticizers and cause your plastics to fall apart. Can you comment on any of that?
Well, I'll be brief because this is not my area of expertise, but the first thing is that's absolutely correct. Like I said, about 10%, 10 to up to 80% in the case of PVC of the weight of plastic is made of plastic additives. And biocide indeed come into the mix for the reason that you very clearly outlined. So that is also something that we've heard, and that is also, I think, commented in the report, although in not so much detail. The other link that is interesting between biocides and plastic or pesticides is how microplastic and nanoplastic are now being used in pesticides and biocides formulation for agriculture for a better release or time release of those pesticides. So we're actually voluntarily putting microplastic on our fields where we grow our food that comes with the toxic chemicals and pesticides for as a release agent of pesticides. So that's another connection that exists between the use and release of microplastic and pesticides. And I'm sorry that I can get into much more detail.
Thank you very much. That's very accurate.
On biocides, I'd just like to attract your attention to work by the Food Packaging Forum based in Switzerland. They look at different chemicals in food packaging materials and their impact on health. And so they have a sort of review of research on biocides specifically. It's a little bit dated, but I'm sure the researcher would be available if you contact her. If you email me, I'll send you the dossier. It's like an 8-page document that is an overview of research on biocides in food contact materials.
Thank you. I think we have time for probably one more question, maybe two.
Hi, this is Abby from Conservation Law Foundation. I had a question on your on the waste to energy facilities. So I'm not sure, I've been doing a little bit of research on Azoulay in Oregon, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. Yes. But they're fairly new, and they seem to be successful, although of course, like a lot of the information that's out there is their own propaganda, so that might not be true. But the question I have with them is, so we had said there's like no real recycling of plastic, it's just downcycling, but they claim that they can make that they have no loss in product, basically, that it's 100% recyclable. And then they claim it's zero emission. And as we were talking about, when you burn the syngas, there's emissions, but they claim that's lower emissions than you would be getting if you got virgin fuel. And then also, you know, we talk about if you were to ban, theoretically, all plastic and switch to alternatives, most of the alternatives aren't really working currently either, because like either compostable alternatives don't actually wind up being compostable, or biodegradable things aren't actually biodegradable. So I'm just wondering, like, is that actually a viable alternative where we could like 100% recycle the plastic, as opposed to maybe going down a different route that has just as bad, I mean, different, but arguably maybe just as bad consequences of pollution-wise, at least.
Right, thanks. So maybe first to answer your question on substitution, we acknowledge that, you know, any material that we use at the scale that we're using plastic is going to have environmental impacts, and we're not advocating simply the substitution of, you know, single-use throwaway plastics with other materials that would be similarly disposable. You know, we really have to think about our planetary limits, about resource scarcity, about climate change. And I think that's why there's so much energy behind the circular economy model and behind the framework of, you know, reusing and refurbishing in order not to use our materials that we have access to on this planet so irresponsibly. So I would agree that, you know, simple substitution while keeping our throwaway model is not viable. and that's not what we're advocating. In terms of Azoulay, it's the same challenge we have with these, staged incineration plants. Most of the time, the information that's available is only the industry information. That plant is quite new. I'm not aware of any independent assessment of environmental impact. And as mentioned, the monitoring protocols that exist are really inadequate. So what we know about Azoulay, Oregon, is that they were somehow related to opposition to a recent attempt to pass a single-use plastic ban in Oregon. And I think that it's this structural opposition of, are we trying to reduce? Are we taking into account climate impacts and emissions, or are we trying to give the plastic industry a pretext to keep producing exponentially, right? So yes, in a nutshell, I'd be happy to exchange in more detail if this is a plant you're looking at in particular.
And I just want to add one thing. I don't know about this particular plant, but what I found in most discussion with industry people is they start by telling you that they can do old plastic and it's entirely clean. And then you said, but so including chlorine? So no, old plastic, but nothing with chlorine, or nothing with brominated flame retardant, or not these kind of plastic. So PET, basically. Yeah, so they say PET, but not all kinds of PET. And then you start exploring about, well, what happens to the phthalates? What happened to the other additives that in there? And you always get, I actually have never gotten a straightforward answer or convincing answer about this from anyone I've spoken to.
Thank you. I think we are out of time for questions, but I imagine that the presentation raised a lot of questions. I encourage you to look at the report, to reach out to David and Sirine if you have further questions. They've made their emails available to you. You can also contact me at diana@akaction.org. Especially if you had difficulty with the presentation, I just wanted to remind you that it can be found on our website, but if you have difficulty downloading it, please contact me. Maybe I can send it to you directly. I do want to invite our speakers to make any concluding remarks before I wrap the call up. And I want to thank everyone, of course, for calling in today and participating.
I just want to thank ACAT for the opportunity to reach out to your audience. I want to thank all of you who took the time to listen to this. And again, invite you, as was just done by Diana, to look at the report, look at the information, the various links that we provided, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Do not expect an immediate answer, at least for me, but you will get an answer, and I'll be most happy to hear from you any question you may have. So thank you very, very much again.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, echoing what David said and just emphasizing that we're really grateful for your attention. We think this is a pivotal moment, with the crisis in plastic recycling, and now's the time to push for reduction so we don't end up with actually, more incineration and more environmental impact and health impacts for our communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Simi. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.